Hello, my name is Jennifer Jill Schwirzer. Some people call me Dr. Jen. You can call me whatever you want, but I am here to share with you some really important messages that will help us incorporate more positive emotion into our lives. They're called the Joy Sessions. We want to feel as positively as we can possibly feel in this broken world. You know, just to tell you a little about myself, I love the intersection between psychology and theology. I'm a Bible student and I have a doctoral degree in psychology and counseling, and I have had a private counseling practice for many years. So I'm here to share some practical tips with you, but also get into the deep theology of the issues surrounding our emotions. And I'm going to start with a talk that I call the why of joy. Now, the reason I want to address the why of joy is to make sure that our positive emotions are grounded in truth and fact and reason. And there is, in fact, a reason to be happy, and I want to share that with you. But the reason I don't want to have joy that is not grounded in reason is because one of the things we look for when we're trying to assess a person's mental state is if they're testing reality. And in this broken world, a lot of negative things happen. And if we're happy in a way that's sort of dismantled from the reality around us, then it could be that we're not testing reality. We want you to be cheerful, but not delusional. So we're going to be talking about the why of joy. And in specific, we're going to talk about how God's storyline helps us understand how he can be good and still allow evil to exist. How can God be good and still allow evil to exist? Because we want to wrestle with that question so that we make sure our positive emotions are grounded in good theology and truth. So the study of how God can be good in the face of evil is called Theodicy. It is a philosophical and theological study. Brilliant minds have written volumes on Theodicy. And I'm just going to be sharing, my take on it. But I wanted to share something with you up front, and that is that I was thinking about this one day, and I noticed that Theodicy sounded a lot like the Odyssey. The Odyssey, if you don't know, is an ancient epic poem written by the Greek poet Homer. And it was amazing to me that they sounded so similar, Theodicy, the Odyssey. But then I looked into the story behind the Odyssey by Homer, and I realized that it was very similar to God's story. And here's the thing, is that we want to try, and I'm going to be trying in this first session anyway, to bring us into a place of empathy with God in his situation. Because we're going to see that he's facing a very difficult dilemma of how to be good and still allow evil to exist. That's hard on us. But it's also hard on him, and I want to bring us into a place of understanding and empathy and seeing things to some degree from his standpoint. And in order to do that, we have to go a little bit into the backstory. When I assess a client, for example, I always ask myself, what's the backstory that led them to the point that they're at today with the problems that they need help with? And so I ask them about their backstory, and I'm going to be going a little bit into God's backstory as to how he got to the place where he is today. But it's very interesting that the narrative of the Odyssey and Theodicy are quite similar. The Odyssey by Homer has a king going on a journey, coming back to his kingdom, and in the interim, an evil interloper has come to try to steal from him his kingdom and his bride. Well, Theodicy is really kind of the same story, because there's an evil interloper that has tried to steal from God his kingdom and his bride, in the sense that his people are his bride. And so Theodicy and the Odyssey have a lot in common, and that's what nerdy people like me do in their spare time. So let's look at the biblical rollout of Theodicy in a few texts here. And let's just, look at God's storyline and try to get his backstory a little bit. See, the triune God created the universe in love. We're told that God is love. Very simple, straightforward statement there. The Father created through the Son. In the beginning was the Word, Jesus. And then we're told that part of his creation was an honored angel, Lucifer. He was called Son of the Morning. He was a beautiful and honored being with many talents and many gifts and much power. And then we're told that Lucifer somehow became jealous of God. His heart was lifted up, we're told, in the prophet Isaiah. And then we're told that as a result of that and the conflict that ensued, war broke out in heaven. What a strange thing to have war in a place like heaven, but the Bible is clear that war broke out in heaven. And then we see that Lucifer and his angels ultimately lost that war and were cast down to the earth. And then we see that God created humanity to witness of his love. Why did he do that? Let's think for a moment about earthly trials and earthly conflicts. If you are asked to serve on a jury and it is found that the person being tried is a loved one or a relative or someone you know, you will be disqualified from serving on that jury because of the emotional connection to that individual and the bias that comes with that emotional connection. Let's think about the angels for a moment. They loved Lucifer. He was their brother. They also loved and were bonded to God. They were in a position not unlike what children of divorcing parents experience, where their biases go both ways. So really even the unfallen angels were torn in two by the conflict between God and Lucifer. And they may have been intellectually convinced that God was righteous and Lucifer was sinful. But I don't know if you've experienced this. Sometimes it takes a while for our emotions to catch up to our intellectual convictions. And so the way God handled that conflict was so delicate and so careful because he cares about our emotions. So we see that that God created humanity to witness of his love. God was no longer in a place where he could witness for himself. He created an order of being that would be so much like him that the unfallen beings could look upon humanity and see a revelation of God himself. Isn't that beautiful? And what an inspiring theme that is. We have meaning and purpose to our lives because of the purpose for which God created us. Well, unfortunately, humanity itself fell into sin as well. And we needed a revelation of God's character. We're told in Genesis chapter 3 that Adam and Eve partook of the fruit and fell into sin. And drastic changes took place in the world and in their nature as a result of that. But we're also told that the calling of God is irrevocable. In other words, God found another way around. And he still called humanity to witness of his love in the universe. So that's just a very fast, sweeping overview of God's backstory and where we find ourselves today. I want to read kind of a summation statement to you that is very helpful to me as to why God didn't just destroy Lucifer instantly. I mean, it certainly seems like the easier way of handling the affair. But listen to this: the inhabitants of heaven and of the worlds, being unprepared to comprehend the nature or consequences of sin, could not then have seen the justice of God in the destruction of Satan. Had he been immediately blotted out of existence, some would have served God from fear rather than love. Now, they would have been loyal to God, but they would have served him from fear rather than love. Notice how much God cares about our emotional state, about our emotional life. He's the one that created us in his image to have all of these intense and complex emotions. And he, of all beings, cares for those emotions and cared even for the emotions of angels. So rather than just wipe him out, God took the slow route to winning the war against Lucifer. Now, one of the things we run into in behavioral health as we're trying to help people that have mental disorders is we guard against what we call flight to health. When things get too good too fast, we get suspicious because we know that the gains that are brought about through effort and struggle are the gains that tend to be stable gains. So if someone just busts out of depression and one day they're better, chances are maybe they're having a manic episode, or maybe something else is going on that has given them this flight to health. So God is this way. He honors the fact that life can be a struggle, and that we can sometimes confront difficulties that we struggle with day after day. Don't give up, people. God is going to stay with you through that struggle, and the victory that you gain through that is more valuable than a flight to health would be. So God is like this. He's about this. He, rather than just wipe out Satan, took the slow route to winning the war against him. So I want to talk a little bit about the intersection between God's sovereignty and his granting of free will, because I think it's very important that we keep a careful balance between those two things. People can emphasize God's sovereignty, and it is true that he governs the universe, and we cannot deny that and really claim to believe the Bible. But God also grants his creatures the ability to choose, and particularly human beings having this cerebral cortex in which is housed our free will, have the ability to plan and execute and really to choose in a very volitional way. And God grants us that freedom, and that's part of the problem. Because of all that freedom, we have sin. Look what happened with Adam and Eve. But let's balance God's sovereignty and the fact that he is freedom granting, because what happens if we focus only on his sovereignty is we distort the picture of God. And if someone is suffering as the result of some of the exigencies of living in this sinful world, some tragedy has struck them, and we only emphasize God's sovereignty, we end up saying to them things like, well, it's God's will, or you must have sinned, or you were going to sin. If you look at the book of Job, his friends initially came along, I think it was 2 or 3 of them, and basically said, okay, fess up, dude, what have you done wrong? That's why all this bad stuff happened to you. And then the last friend comes along, and he says, no, they're wrong, they're wrong. It's not that you did something, it's that you were going to do something, and God was preemptively keeping you from doing something. Now, I've had some unfortunate things happen with my health, and I really struggled with some of them. And people would say these very things to me. People would say, what have you done? Fess up. Or more often they would say, well, God saw that in the future you were going to go off course, and so he's trying to protect. And I just propose to you that these things are unhelpful because they don't acknowledge the free agency that is active in our world today. And they make it seem like God is micromanaging the universe. And you will see, hopefully, by the end of this presentation, that God is not a micromanager. But what if we go the other direction and we overemphasize free agency, not recognizing sufficiently God's sovereignty? We might give people the impression that the devil has control, or that God is really a nice guy, but he's up there going, oh dear, what can I do? Nothing. We can make God look impotent. And we can kind of give people a sense things are always going to be this way. And we can sort of breed into people this thing in psychology we call learned helplessness, where people feel like, I can't do anything. And even though they have free agency, there is no help for them in this world. God is a powerful God, and we need to keep that tension between God's sovereignty and free will. So let's talk about God's will for a moment here. I just want to introduce some concepts, some verbiage to you that may help you in understanding how God can be good and yet allow evil to exist. You know, because God does have a will. We're told in Acts chapter 2 that Jesus was crucified by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. That's a pretty strong statement of God having a will. So I like to look at God's will through a few different lenses. One is God's perfect will. And I frame that as if God had his way. What if God had his way? Would Satan ever have, would Lucifer ever have, no, he would never have rebelled. Well, let's say he does. Then God creates humanity. Would humanity have sinned if God had his perfect way? Well, no, they never would have. But let's assume they did. Then God sends Jesus to save humanity. Wouldn't he have wanted humanity to worship him instead of putting him on a cross? Well, yes, that would have been God's perfect will. But we can see that God doesn't always get his way. And that's because when we look at this world, there are multiple wills at odds with each other. So God has set up the world such that he does not always, at every juncture, get his perfect will. But we can also see God's will through the permissive lens, that God does allow things that would not be in line with his perfect will. And that's obvious. I don't think God caused my health problems, but he did allow them to come to me, and I have to acknowledge that. Because he's not helpless, he's sovereign. But thirdly, and the one I want to kind of land on, is God's redemptive will. God is our Redeemer, and he can take the fallout of all the wills that are at work in this world, human wills, demonic wills, the will of Satan himself, and he can take the raw materials of that and shape it toward his redemptive will. And this is a beautiful thing. So let me ask you a question. What's the worst thing that has ever happened on this planet? Now, people may say certain genocides, the Holocaust, various atrocities, but think about it for a moment. All life is in the life of God. And so if you want to kill all of humanity, kill God. So let me ask you again, what's the worst thing that has ever happened? The worst thing that has ever happened on planet Earth is the crucifixion. Let me ask you another question. What's the best thing that has ever happened? The best thing that has ever happened is the cross. The crucifixion is humanity murdering God. The cross is God saving humanity. The worst thing and the best thing is the same thing. And that's what I mean by God's redemptive will. He can take the ultimate misfortune and reshape it into something really powerful and beautiful. You know, the sin and suffering of our planet doesn't reflect the perfect will of God any more than a messy child's room reflects the perfect will of a tidy parent. And I'm kind of venting a little here because I was a very tidy person, a tidy parent, and I had kids, and kids didn't get the tidiness thing. You know, I remember once we had this duck that was very creatively named Quacky, and the duck had a quack that sounded human. And it would just like whack, 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 whack. It would sound really human, and it was kind of creepy. Well, I came into the living room one day after I had cleaned it, and then my kids trashed it. And I said, who messed up this living room? And immediately the duck went whack, 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 like he was making fun of me. It was really creepy and weird. But I know what it's like to be a tidy parent and have the kids mess things up. And that mess did not reflect my nature, my desire, my will at all. I tried to be really nice to my kids in spite of it. And interestingly enough, now both of them are very neat as adults. So we need to realize that God doesn't want things the way that they are. It's particularly difficult for us to address this in the context of innocent suffering. Most of us are okay with God letting people that deserve it suffer, okay? If someone smokes their entire life and they get cancer, we don't typically hold that against God because X plus Y equals Z. Or if someone murders and they end up in jail and they get beat up in jail, we don't feel as bad about that, even though we don't want any person to suffer. But we don't feel as bad about that as we would when it comes to innocent suffering. You know, where this really gets driven home to me is the suffering of children and even the suffering of animals. You know, we had a rat in our home. It was getting into our food supply, and we tried the glue traps and all the have-a-heart traps. None of them worked. My husband put out a real trap, and he caught the rat, and he killed it. And when I saw that rat, don't tell my husband this, okay, but when I saw that rat, I cried. Because I saw the whole thing from the rat's standpoint. The rat wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just trying to get food. I feel sorry for the animals that suffer the consequences of our bad choices as human beings. And so that's a form. Now, many of you won't think a rat is an innocent creature, but actually they make good pets. And certainly you can acknowledge that when my dog died in a tragic accident, that was innocent suffering. He jumped out of a basket out of the basket of my bike. He had never done it before and jumped in front of my wheel, and I hit him, and he ended up dying. It was a tragic situation. I still cry thinking about it. Things like that help us to realize the reality of innocent suffering. And what about children? You know, children in some parts of the world are made to march across landmine-laced fields so that they can figure out where the landmines are. And in the process of that march across that field, the child may lose their life. They may lose a limb. They may lose the ability to walk and have to drag themselves around and beg for the rest of their lives. That is what I mean when I say innocent suffering. It's easier for us to face innocent or suffering that is deserved, but it's very difficult for us to wrestle with innocent suffering. Many of you have seen this photograph. This picture was taken by a photographer named Kevin Carter, who flew to Sudan in 1993 to photograph the famine. He came across this emaciated toddler who had collapsed on the way to a feeding station, and a vulture came along to opportunistically take advantage of that child's weakness. What a tragic picture of war and starvation. Carter won a Pulitzer Prize for this photo, but in July of 1994, just about a year later, he took his own life. Couldn't deal with innocent suffering, and we feel similarly. The question I'm asking now is a very serious one, friends. Why doesn't God at least end innocent suffering? And here's the punchline. For God to confine sin within boundaries of justice would be to mask its true character. The word iniquity in the New Testament is anomia in the Greek, and it means lawlessness. The essence of sin is that it is not just, it is not fair. It is fundamentally unfair and unjust. And for God to carefully manage it, wrap it up, and put a little bow on it and make it act nice would be to mask its true character. So as part of his plan to ultimately redeem humanity from sin, he has to allow sin to be seen for what it really is. I want to draw an analogy here to the cycle of violence. This is something that is well known in behavioral science, and particularly people that deal with domestic violence or interpersonal violence. So let's just say that a beautiful young woman has a very toxic boyfriend, and she's in this cycle with him. And this has been a well-documented cycle. It works like clockwork. It's a pattern that we recognize, those of us that deal with domestic violence and interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, we recognize this cycle. So here's how it works. Maybe there's a calm phase, but then tension starts to build. And the toxic boyfriend, and by the way, I don't mean any disservice to men here. Women can be toxic as well, but for the ease of communication, I'm calling him a toxic boyfriend. So tension starts to build. And that individual starts to get more aggressive. And then something triggers him and he explodes, and there's violence, and she loses a tooth or gets a black eye as the result of the violence. And in that moment when she is treated with violence, she says to herself, I'm getting away from this guy, he's crazy. It would be the end of the story, wouldn't it, if there wasn't this cycle here? But what happens next is the phone call or the flowers or the chocolates where he says, look, I am so sorry for what I did. It was so wrong of me, and I'm going to get help, and things are going to change. Please don't leave me, honey. I love you. I will never make it without you. You won't make it without me. We need to stay together. We're a thing. Please, I beg of you, stay with me. And she melts because she forgets who he was in that moment of violence. And there's a period of calm after that where things are rosy, and she thinks, man, things are better. This is particularly difficult, by the way, for Christian women, because we believe in forgiveness, we believe in grace, we believe in repentance and all those things, and we're inclined to want to, take it at face value and assume the best about people. So it seems for a period of time that the best has finally arrived. But then that tension starts to build again, and there's another eruption of violence, and the cycle goes round and round and round until one day that girl says to herself, I know who he really is. I remember who he is when he's violent, and that's who he is. My boyfriend is toxic, and she breaks that relationship for once and for all. My point is this, that if humanity was a girlfriend, God is trying to lead humanity to break up with humanity's toxic boyfriend, sin and Satan. And in order to do that, we have to see him for the monster he really is. And in order for him to be seen for the monster he really is, God has to let him show his monstrosity. And he will never reveal his monstrosity if God controls him and micromanages him. Let's look at this in parable form. Jesus talked about the parable of the wheat and the tares in Matthew 13. And the story is very simple. It's a farmer, and he sows a bunch of wheat in a field, and then an evil person comes along and sows weeds. I really relate to this parable because I grow a lot of, my husband and I grow a lot of our own food, and we live on a farm, and we try to cultivate the soil, and we live in Orlando, Florida, and there's so many weeds. It's just one big weed jungle down there, and I hate weeds with a hot hatred. So I relate to this parable. So an enemy came along and sowed the tares, or the weeds, in the field where the wheat had just been sown. And the workers came along and they said, should we pull up the weeds? And the farmer said, no. He said, because while you are pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. So for the ultimate destruction of the weeds, and to the end, and out of a desire to see the ultimate destruction of the weeds, the farmer says, don't pull them up just now. That's what God is doing. He ultimately wants to destroy sin. He cannot truly and thoroughly destroy it without letting it be seen for what it is. So it has to grow and come to maturity so that we can see its true character, lest we be deceived by it. Sin, just like a toxic boyfriend, can be very sweet. We're told in Hebrews that it's pleasurable. Sin can be really a feel-good experience, in case you didn't notice. But God has to break that spell. Sin must be fully manifest in order for it to be effectively destroyed without collateral damage. Now, this is C.S. Lewis's way of framing the Theodicy question. He said, if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. I want to ask this. We have one option over here of God being good, nice guy, but impotent. And another option over here of God being powerful enough to end all of our suffering and all of this sin, but either apathetic or downright cruel and unwilling to do it. Is there a third option? And if there's a third option, what is it? I would say there is a third option. And I call that third option the demands of a greater concern. God is answering to the demands of a greater concern. God wants to destroy sin and its power over this universe forever. And that presents a greater concern than our momentary happiness, as much as God would like to bring that about. So I want to look at just a couple of verses, a couple of facts from the book of Daniel. If we look at chapter 7, we see that Daniel is in vision, and he sees Jesus in the form of the Son of Man. And we're told in that passage that he created dominions. And yet the Son of Man gives dominion to the beasts. And the beasts are these evil entities that embody the spirit of Satan. And they're destructive religious and political forces in the world. And the Son of Man actually gives dominion to the beast for a time. Now, the whole concept of dominion is really interesting. When Adam partook of that fruit, he effectively gave the dominion of planet Earth over into the hands of Satan. But God didn't reverse that. What he did is he took the long, slow route to winning dominion back by winning the dominion of human hearts. And so we see that in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 14, that ultimately that dominion is won back. It says, then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. God is into things that last, people. He can't take the short route and do justice to his own conscience, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Let's stay with God through this process of eradicating sin and suffering from the universe. Friends, God will not receive dominion back until he has the dominion of our hearts. And I just want to say, let's give him the dominion of our hearts. I want to talk to you just at the end here briefly about our picture of God and how it affects our prayer life and how that prayer life then affects our mental health, okay? Because I am a mental health provider. So this is very interesting research done by someone named Tanya Luhrmann. And she studied the way that people prayed and specifically the God concept out of which they prayed. And she says the following: those who were able to experience a loving God vividly were healthier, at least as judged by a standard psychiatric scale. When God was experienced as remote or not loving, the more someone prayed, the more psychiatric distress she seemed to have. When God was experienced as close and intimate, the more someone prayed, the less they had. So you can see here that the way we see God affects our prayer life. If we're constantly going to God with this poverty mindset, like he's stingy and like he's withholding, then we can actually create an impression in our own minds that God is stingy and withholding. Let's go to him in faith. The Bible says that he is love, that there is nothing he wouldn't give but to make us permanently and eternally happy. Let's have some faith in that and press forward to be closer to him from that place. So my conclusion here is that because of the gospel, we can safely and sanely experience peace, joy, love, and a host of other positive emotions. Amen and amen. I wanted to build that rational basis for us experiencing positive emotions. Because of the gospel, we can be happy in spite of all the negativity around us. And I aim to help you develop those positive emotions and be as happy as you can possibly be this side of eternity. So I'm going to give you a little takeaway for each of these sessions, something you can do, like an action step you can do until you watch the next session. So my takeaway today is look to the cross for evidence of God's love. That's where you'll see that there is nothing that he would not give but to make you eternally secure and happy in that love. May God bless you, and thank you so much.